Hello and welcome to the 2020 Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to leaders and elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for joining us virtually to celebrate the festival's 10th anniversary. This session, Fostering Innovation Through Leadership and Storytelling, is brought to you by session partner Barker's Trailers and contributors Anecdote and People Measures. Today's guests are Shawn Callahan, founder of Anecdote, the world's largest business storytelling enterprise, and James Fremantle from leadership consultancy group People Measures. To get us started, Shawn will explore the topic 7 ways to use storytelling to foster innovation. Shawn's company Anecdote helps leaders and sellers find and tell great oral stories. Today, he will provide you with advice on how to use inspirational storytelling methods to spread the word about innovation in your business. Shawn, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much.
We really look forward to your advice on how we can use storytelling to our advantage. So I'll hand over to you now and join you at the end for some questions.
Yeah, well, it's so good to be here. I'm just thinking that this is great timing, actually, because in the last 3 months, I've been collecting innovation stories. I've been collecting them from a large pharmaceutical company and also from a government science agency, actually. And I tell you, I've been collecting stories now for, I don't know, probably over 20 years. And there's definitely a pattern emerging in terms of the types of stories people tell, the types of stories people hear that help people understand and make progress with innovation. And so I just wanted to share some of those, observations with you, and hopefully they'll sort of trigger some ideas on what you can do with innovation stories in your organisation and in all your endeavours. But the first thing I wanted to start with is this idea that it's actually more than storytelling, right? I know the presentation was titled 7 Things You Can Do in Storytelling, but the reality is we want to broaden this out to story work. And what I mean by that is a combination of storytelling, story listening, and story triggering. Right now, everyone knows about storytelling, so I won't explain that one so much. But story listening is just that technique of getting people to tell you stories. And of course, this is where you learn so much, right? When people share real life experiences with you, that's when you get to understand how things actually work, right? Now, story triggering is when you do something remarkable so that other people tell stories about it. Now, this is so important for innovators and inventors because sometimes you have to do something remarkable to people for people to pay attention to what you're up to and the new ideas. New ideas are hard to get going, right? So you've got to do something that's remarkable to get people to, start talking about it. So I'm going to go through each one of these things, give you some suggestions in each area and tell you some stories and let's sort of see whether these some things that jump out and make sense for you. So I guess the first thing that we really have to be thinking about is failure stories, right? I guess with failure stories, it's very easy just to listen to success stories, but the real learning, if you like, come from failure stories. I remember a number of years ago, I met a lady called Teresa Bailey. She works at a jet propulsion lab in Pasadena, California. And she was telling me that they had a big event occurring where the Genesis space capsule was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and it had a very delicate cargo on it. So delicate that just having the parachute bring it down to Earth was not a soft enough landing. So they got this idea of using helicopters with big hooks to hook into the parachute to bring this cargo to the ground in a safe way. Well, on the day, everyone was very excited. They had lots of monitors. The people in the hangars were actually sitting in rows of seats watching these big screens to sort of see how it all worked. And the helicopters were getting in position, 3 helicopters, and they were watching the capsule come flying down towards Earth, and the parachute doesn't open, and it just hurtles past the helicopters and smashes into the ground. Now, Teresa Bailey told me this because every week she runs in the library a session for project managers of all the projects they're doing to come in and tell the story of the failures and the successes of their project. And so as soon as this happened, she thought, this is great. This is a great story for to be told. So she went down and talked to Bob Sweetman, who was the project manager. Hey, Bob, can you tell us about this? He didn't want to have a bar of it. He didn't want to tell that story. The shame was too much. The embarrassment was just too much for him to cope with. Anyway, she let it go, let it slide. And a year later, she came back and he said he was ready to do it then. And the place was just packed. People wanted to know what they could learn from a failure, right? So you've got to put yourself in positions where you can hear some of these failure stories. You've got to put situations in place in your organisation where failure stories can be told, but understanding the delicacy around failure stories. So we've got to go out and hear failure stories, and you just got to ask yourself, how important these are. Just ask yourself what goes around an organisation faster, stories of success or stories of failure. I think you'll find it's the latter, right? So that's number one. Number two is I think we really got to put a lot of effort in hearing stories of problems actually being solved, right? Now, back in 1996, a guy called Julian Orr, he was a ethnographer, did this great study of Xerox photocopy repairmen. And, you probably remember these massive photocopiers there were back in those days. And he hung out with the repairmen, listened to what they were doing, and he noticed that the way in which they fixed these machines is that they would tell the stories of their efforts to get them fixed. This is how they built their skill. This is how they found all the exceptions and all the details and all the ins and outs of actually fixing these massive machines. And they're very technical stories. Here's an example of one, right? So he was talking about this display that came up on one of the machines. It would pop up with an E053 error. And the expert who was talking about this, he groans and he says, God, I remember the first one I had of these. It was what I think it is. I got a E053 and immediately started replacing the dead shortened dichrotrons that were blowing up the circuit breaker. But as soon as I did this, I created a 24-volt interlock problem, and you can chase that one forever and never found out what it is. I happened to pull up the DC20 log, and I could see I was getting hits on the XER board, and it was the XER failure. So I replaced it, and then I've got to learn how to say that. The dichrotrons and stress tested the bugger and the real error code display. You can't believe what that machine tells you. And you can sort of see these are very technical stories, right? And only someone in that field would understand them. But you've got to put yourself in those places where you can hear those stories, be part of that back and forwards that happens to see how problems are actually solved. And again, it just builds your repertoire and patterns of what's possible and how to tackle things. So the third tip is to hear success stories, right? And of course, one of the most famous success stories around innovation is James Dyson. As a 39-year-old, he was building essentially a wheelbarrow that had a ball as the front wheel instead of a tyre. And he was trying to paint the forks of that wheelbarrow, and he was losing lots of paint. So he thought, okay, what can I do here? Asked around. He found out that the very professional painters would actually have a cyclone vacuum extractor. He thought, oh, I've seen one of those. He had a timber mill just down the road. So he went down and had a look, jumped over the fence, took some measurements, built himself one of those in the back of his yard for his wheelbarrow project. And then about the same time, and this is how insights happen all the time, it's a connection of ideas, his wife and him buy a Hoover vacuum cleaner. And they're not happy with it. The bag, gets filled up, the dust gets stuck in the bag. And he has the idea that maybe he can use these cyclone vacuums to do it. So he builds himself a cardboard version of it, a little prototype, shows that it actually works. And then he sets about actually building the actual machine. Takes him over 5,000 prototypes over 3 years. And then, of course, when he does it, no one's interested in it. He has to build his own company, eventually gets his own funding, and, of course, the rest is history. But you've got to hear these stories to sort of see all the ins and outs. And that was the short telling. I mean, the long telling is, excuse me, all sorts of things to consider in terms of what happens actually with James Dyson. Now, of course, not everyone is innovating as an individual innovator on their own or an inventor. More often than not, we're inside organisations. So you've got to understand how your organisation innovates, or what they do to stop innovation and what they do to help it. I got this photo because it reminded me of an experience I had working for the Defence Science and Technology Organisation, and they just built this beautiful atrium designed for people to get together and have conversations. And within the first week of opening this building, there was lots of levels above it with very senior people. One of the senior people leant over the ledge and just yelled out, "Can you guys be quiet down there?" So all the conversation that was happening stopped. And then all of a sudden, people just stopped going there. Talk about killing innovation in one fell swoop. The flip side is that, organisations that seem to be able to create a space for innovation, the extra, side projects that they can get done that doesn't have big expectations, has a little bit of funding, they're the ones that actually get moving in organisations. You can't fill the space with just all the things you need to do your standard work if you want innovation to happen as well. So companies like 3M and Google, they've added that 20%. And by the way, it usually ends up being 20% beyond your normal work, right? But it gives some space and some time for people to actually try stuff out. So you can understand how innovation works in your own organisation, and they hear that from the stories around your company. Now, of course, when we get to the point of telling stories, one of the important stories to tell here are your future stories. And Steve Jobs was famous for this. He'd be able to tell a story of where the computing industry was going, where Apple was being taken. And he did it also for the Macintosh. When that was launched in 1984, this is the sort of story that he told. IBM wants it all. Apple is the only hope to give it a run for its money. Dealers now fear an IBM-dominated, controlled future. They're turning back to Apple to ensure their future freedom. IBM wants it all, and it's aiming its guns on its last obstacle to industry control, Apple. But will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry, the entire information age? Was George Orwell right? Now, of course, then he plays the famous 1984 advertisement they did at the Super Bowl. But he's sort of setting this story about what potentially the fear actually he was creating about what might happen in the future. It doesn't always have to be a fear story. It could be an inspirational, positive story, right? But you've got to paint that picture for people to see how your innovation is going to make a difference, right? To change that future in some way. And look, whenever you're meeting people, it's important also to be able to tell the story of why you care, right? And one of the best examples of this for me was an architect. We were doing some work for an architecture firm, and they were going to build a beautiful new building for a university. Where this architect went and saw the vice-chancellor, had a big meeting with him, and after he finished, he headed up to catch his Uber, and as he's waiting for his Uber to arrive, he turns around and he's just looking at the grounds of the university. He thinks to himself, "Oh my God, this is so beautiful, this university." And he cancels his Uber and spends the next 2 hours just walking through the university, to understand how everything fits together and to really appreciate and sort of, draw it all in. And as soon as he told us that, we sort of said that's a great connection story. When you're pitching this, you really need to start with that story, because it shows that you're here more than for the money. You want to make a difference. There's passion involved in what you're doing. So this idea of telling a connection story is so important. My seventh tip is around triggering stories. I guess the triggering stories, the key thing is that I guess I was reminded of this story of Stephen Gass. Stephen Gass developed a technology called saw stop, and it was simply a saw that would stop as soon as it touched flesh. Now, for a long time, he only tested this out on hot dogs, right? But he knew one day he'd have to test it out on a real-life human. That real-life human was going to be him. So on a summer afternoon in year 2000, he decided to get that 4,000 RPM blade going, and he was taking his pinky and he was going to push it into the saw. And he did that, and he closed his eyes and pushed into the saw, and he heard the whole thing go to a crashing halt, which is supposed to do, that's the design, and looked down. There was blood on his finger, but he still had his finger, right? It just scraped his finger. He knew this thing was going to work. And with that, that was a story that just got told over and over again. And so he triggered a story. And I think this is one of the real key things, is you got to find situations which have happened that will get people talking about what you're doing. And that's how you trigger stories. Now, anything to do with life and death, anything to do with, sort of blood and pain are actually good stories, right? So Stephen Gass definitely had something going for him in that particular story type. But you'll find your own stories there to trigger. Now, I always like to add another extra. I said 7, but I thought of another one just at the end, just to give us something to round it out. And that is this idea of combating anti-stories. So for every story you tell, your naysayers will tell a story to beat your story. And here's the thing, you can only beat a story with a better story, right? So when someone says, safety doesn't sell, which they did with Steve Gass, you can't sort of say, no, safety does sell, and these are the figures. You would actually tell a better story, right? When people were sort of saying, look, they're only just PCs. Steve Jobs can't just come back with data sort of listing out what this means. You got to come back with a better story. And so that's, the approach that you have to take, is find the anti-stories that are working against you, and then tell a better story. So that's it. That's all I had for you. These are the 8 different things to consider when developing your innovation using storytelling. But it's not just storytelling, it's story work. So we want to hear your failure stories, hear your problem-solving stories, hear success stories, hear organizational innovation stories, tell future stories, tell connection stories, trigger stories about your work, and combat anti-stories. If you want to learn more about storytelling, feel free to check out my book. I'll give you all sorts of ideas on how to actually do it. And and if anyone wants to get in contact, here's my details. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your stories.
Thank you so much, Shaun, for that presentation. It was fantastic, really insightful, and lots of great tips, I think, for our audience to take away and apply in their own business. So we have some questions that we'll dive into. So the first one is, how do you start your storytelling journey? And how do you make sure that your story is a great story for your audience or your business, and that it passes the pub test, I suppose, that it's entertaining and gets all the points across that you need?
Yeah, I think the pub test is a good way of putting it, because I really love stories which just sound like stories you're just chatting to someone about, rather than performed stories. We don't want to do that, because that doesn't sound right in an organizational setting. So getting started, I think there's a couple of things you probably want to do. One is be very clear on understanding what's a story versus what is not a story. Because everyone's using the word story at the moment. They're sort of saying things, we need to have a story. And then they'll say, our story is persistence. And I'm thinking, that doesn't sound like a story to me, right? So if you search around on our website, you'll find our story spotting framework. And it's really good for just helping people, pinpoint what a story is. And then I would just listen to podcasts that give you examples of stories. There's lots of podcasts out there just are full of business stories, and then you can sort of try them out. And when you're testing a story, you want to make sure you tell it and see what response you get from your audience and know what the point of your story is. So there's some little bits of advice I would suggest to get started.
Yeah, fantastic. And are you getting that feedback back or that reaction that you want from your story? So, yeah, absolutely plan it out. The next question, what's the benefits of telling a story about failure and how do you prepare to tell that story? You reflected on in your talk about that person that took them a year to talk about the failure of that crash landing. So how do you prepare yourself to talk about what didn't go so well?
Well, I think, with that particular example, almost immediately they started telling the story internally in his own project team, right? Because they were trying to work out how, what happened and what went wrong. And so that would be the first amount of storytelling that would occur. But for it to be heard by people beyond his project team, that's the bit that took a year before that occurred. And you have to get to a point where you feel confident in yourself, in your own abilities, in where you sit in the organisation. And if you can tell a failure story, it shows that confidence and it gives people a real sense of your character. I'm actually advocating not so much you going out and telling failure stories. I want you to listen for failure stories because that's what you will learn from, right? And so you want to you really have your ear tuned for someone who's starting to tell a story of failure. And if you want, you should help them out a little bit, to ask them questions. Oh, so what happened next? So how did you get around that? And, that must have been really difficult, but what was the next step? And few of those sort of questions, they'll just, get more comfortable. And maybe you take them down to the pub. See, the pub test is another thing. Take them to the pub, have a couple of drinks, and you'll get the full failure stories then.
And from failure, there's always the bounce back. There's always how you improved and how you got better. So
got to have the bounce back.
Yep, absolutely. The positive is always there. So how do you, you say you can only beat a story with a better story. So how do you keep your story authentic and not sort of let, truth get in the way of a good story, that you're keeping to the facts and still making it entertaining?
Yeah, I mean, every story you tell, you should be telling what actually happened. I'm not advocating for people to make up stories. No, definitely not, because you're going to get caught out if you do that, especially in organisations. Everyone's trying to test your story to see actually if it happened or not. But what I mean is that if someone says to you, look, safety does not sell, right? We tried to sell this product on the basis of safety 5 years ago, and it was a failure. So that's a little story about how safety doesn't sell. Now, if you're just about to build a product like the SawStop product, which is all about safety, you need to be able to tell a story that beats that story, right? Because it's very hard for people to just change their mind without hearing a new bit of evidence. Right, so you've got to find some anecdotal evidence, and that's what you do. You find that, and if you don't have it, you've got to go out and do something that actually creates that evidence, right? So that's how you do it. Is you find examples of, first of all, in your organisation. If it's not, you can't find it there, you go beyond other organisations which are like you. They'll have examples, or maybe you have to go to another industry. But you've got to find other examples. In this case, where safety sells, right? And they'll be there. Find the hook, that's right, exactly.
And to our final question, how does storytelling keep us optimistic?
Well, I think the great thing, especially these future stories, it's about knowing that you can create a solution, right? And that you'll have a good answer. And eventually it works out, right? You look at Dyson's example. I mean, it took him, 3 years to do those 5,000 prototypes. Right now, imagine you're in, 18 months into it. I'm sure James Dyson must have been thinking, I wonder if this is ever going to go anywhere, right? Problem after problem after problem. But he eventually gets through and generates this really amazing company as a result of it. That's the optimism. Any problem can be sorted out, right? It just requires resources, the thinking, the excitement, the enthusiasm, the optimism for it to actually occur.
Well, we can always benefit from sharing our experiences, from learning from each other and ultimately moving forward and making good decisions in our businesses and in our lives. So thank you so much, Shaun, for your expertise today.
It was a pleasure.
Excellent. We will next be joined by James Fremantle, Director of People Measures, who will cover the topic of communications, people, leadership. James is a coach in media, presenting and leadership for CEOs, sports people, politicians and public servants. Today, his presentation focuses on the problem of how do I fill space, which is designed to help leaders have conscious, strategic answers to this simple question. James, welcome to the 2020 BIIF and thank you for your time today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Alexia. I'm really looking forward to this festival. Being a country boy from regional Victoria, it's a big passion of mine.
Well, we're very pleased to have you join us today and we look forward to you sharing your skills in media training, teaching and performing arts to help our leaders tuning in. So I'll hand over to you now and join you for some questions at the end.
Thanks, Alexia. The spirit of invention and innovation starts with choices. Like, how full is that glass? The choice of optimism or the choice of pessimism? My work as a TV producer, filmmaker, newsreader in Moscow, general gadabout, and particularly in the last 12 years, my work in communications and leadership have led me to believe that how do I fill space is one of the most important questions that we can ask ourselves. Up until 1954 in the US, schools were segregated by race. Then when desegregation happened, people from poorer communities, which were black communities, were bused into white communities to go to school. In 1970, there was a young girl with an Indian mother and a Jamaican father who was part of that busing program and who had the opportunities of education that have borne fruit over the years. And I'll come back to her. In 1958, there was a young man driving in the streets of Melbourne, a T-model Ford, and he skidded on tram tracks and hit a power pole. And he went into hospital. He lost a leg. He had severe head injuries and other body injuries. And when he came out of hospital, he was asked by his employer to come and work for him as a landscaper. And he turned up with a raw stump. He didn't have, it wasn't hard enough to wear a wooden leg yet. And his boss, John Roberts, who'd been on the Burma Tire Railway for 3 years, said to him, "Here's a sledgehammer, bust up this concrete path." And that man thought that he couldn't do it. He thought that he was incapable. But you don't argue with John Roberts. And he took that sledgehammer and he sat on his bum for a week and busted up the concrete path. And from that moment on, he realised that the choices he made in his head would determine the future of his life. I'd like to talk about the red gum model, which is based on the two symbiotic relationships of energy exchange that happen in a tree. The first one is photosynthesis, and the second one, respiration. Now, photosynthesis occurs in the foliage of a tree. Sun shines on the leaves of the tree, reacts with the chlorophyll, produces energy which pumps down through the trunk of the tree to grow the root system. At the same time, the root system is sucking in moisture and nutrients from the soil, pumping them up through the trunk of the tree to grow the foliage. Now, I've got there on the screen, you can see the chemical equation for photosynthesis and respiration, which is really not that important unless you're into chemistry. But the thing that we know about those two exchanges of energy is that if one of those systems isn't working, the tree doesn't survive. tree doesn't prosper. And it's the same with human beings. If we think of the foliage of our trees as being our external communications, those communications are made up of our visual messaging, our vocal messaging, and our verbal messaging. Now, the difference between those is visual messaging is everything that people see. It's your body language. It's what happens on your face, those muscle movements on your face that create a message, create a presence. At the moment, a lot of that presence is created, of course, within a rectangle. It's the screen that people see of us. And so we have to think about things like what's in the back of our screen. What can people see in our homes, in our offices? What else are people getting to know about us just from what they see? The second one is the vocal. Now, the vocal is how we use our voices. And that relates to things like the pitch in our voice, highs and lows, the pace at which we speak. And sometimes if you want to build excitement, you speak more quickly. If you want to nail your key points, you speak more slowly. The volume at which we speak. And we know that in general, people hear volume as authority and confidence. I know that working as a newsreader, nobody ever spoke quietly when they were reading the news. Not because the microphone couldn't hear the sound, any sound in the studio, but because by using a strong volume and a lower part of one's vocal range, you were able to create a sense of authority. So what we're doing is creating an experience of who we are for our audiences, whoever our audiences are. And this is important, not just in media, not just in our presentations or standing up in front of big groups, but in our everyday interactions. The third part of our communications is the verbal part, and that's the words that we use, the actual content. It's what we say. Now, we know from a lot of research over the years, right back to the days of Albert Maharabian in the 1960s and 70s, that the impacts in our messaging, visually and vocally, are stronger generally than the verbal impacts. So if I was to say to you, if I was talking to you and I was to say, that's a terrific idea, we should really do that, you're not going to believe me. You're going to take away from that, that is a terrible idea, we are not going to do that. And so the way that I say something has a lot more impact than what I actually say. So how does this relate to leadership and to the challenges that we're facing in society currently? And I think particularly to the challenge of remaining optimistic. Every time we interact with someone else, we share something of ourselves. Most of the time, we do that without thinking about it. It's subconscious or unconscious even. When we start looking at what's in our foliage, what's in our external communications, we become more conscious of what we are choosing to share in every interaction that we have. Now, that means that our displayed emotional context, and that emotional context being the combination of our visual, our vocal, our verbal messaging. And what I mean by that is if someone describes someone as angry, it's because of a mixture of how they look at the time, maybe a tense face, maybe shoulders up here, maybe a frown. Their voice might be loud, it might be very quick, it might be short. And verbally, the things they might be saying might be very direct and perhaps personal. So you put that combination together and then someone says, well, that person's angry. Now, if we can be more composed, if we get on the balcony, if we like, and we say, okay, in this context, how do I want to be displaying my emotion? And we go, then, okay, what does that look like visually? What does it sound like vocally and verbally? So when we think about how we want to display our emotions, we need to make sure that that is connected to who we really are, not that we're pretending, not that we're making it up. And so that's where we have to look into our own root systems. And leadership starts from within. So the Red Gum model talks about what we call the 6 V's of the vibe. And in the external part of our communications, we've got our visual, vocal, and verbal, which we've talked about. Then in our internal communications, we've got the virtuous, the values-based, and the vital. And these 3 things are what I reckon we need to check in on when we're thinking about how are we making our choices of how we bring ourselves to our work. So virtuous is a really simple, perhaps naive concept, and it's basically what's good about you and what you represent. The values-based is probably something that people think about a little bit more, and that's what are the values or the principles that guide the decisions that you make in your life. What are the things you don't compromise on? And the vital is what are you completely passionate about? Because in reality, we can't be passionate about everything that we do in work. It's not really possible. So if we can hone in on the things that we are passionate about and then bring that passion to other areas, then that's replicable and that feeds into our displayed emotion. And we're quite used to that idea that that the way we feel, the way we see the world, the way we look at the world, the way we experience the world feeds into the way we communicate in the world. And then, therefore, the way that other people see us and experience us. But what we're not so used to, I think, is that we can change the things that we do in our visual, vocal, and verbal messaging so that it creates feedback loops which make us feel differently, see the world differently, experience the world differently. Now, what I mean by that is, let's use an example of giving a presentation. Most people find giving a presentation something that makes them nervous, makes them a bit fearful. Now, if what you're showing to the people that you're giving this presentation to feel like you are nervous, see your nervousness, see your fear perhaps, then that may not be strategically advantageous to you in getting your message across and influencing this audience. So you might need to choose a different emotion to express. How about confidence? Now, you can't just pretend to be confident, but what you can do is learn how to breathe more calmly, how to use your voice in a way that sounds confident, and speak in a way that probably reflects the confidence that you have in what you actually know. So what you do then is you go, okay, I feel nervous here. I'm not denying that, but I'm going to just put that aside because I'll draw on my communication abilities to be confident, to look confident, to sound confident. And then I go, what does my voice sound like when I'm confident? What does my body language look like? In other words, how do I fill space when I look confident? And then I deliver with those things feeding into me. And what happens is that instead of people seeing my nervousness and perhaps checking their watches or texting or yawning or giving me the sympathy look, that in fact what people do is they lean forward, they start nodding, they interact, they take notes, they're into it. they are responding to your confidence. And what happens is you see what they're doing, and that feeds back to you, and that makes you feel more confident. Right. So I'm saying that we can, to a certain extent at least, make choices about the presence that we create and the way that we influence people and the way that our feelings can change the way that other people feel as well. So, COVID-19, it's a disaster at one end, it's an opportunity at the other. The questions that we can ask ourselves are, where do we sit on this axis? Where is it a disaster, or where is it a big challenge? Where are the negatives? Where are the positives? Where are the opportunities? What can we take from this that we will keep, that we will continue to evolve into? And how do we express our meaning within all that? Because you can get any number of negative views about COVID-19, about the challenges, about the economic downturn, about the health implications, about the fatalities, about people in aged care being isolated and vulnerable. But you can also look for the positives in the way that we are changing our views on what's important in life, which relationships are important. How do we bring the best of ourselves to this challenge? People have had to do this before, and people will continue to do this to decide how they fill space. Gamilaroi woman Brooke Boney, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, the Chinese on the goldfields in Victoria, the Muslims trying to maintain their faith, that first grader who I talked about who bussed from the white to the white community to have her schooling was Kamala Harris, the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats in the US. And she has had to make those decisions about how she sees herself, how she wants to be seen and experienced by other people, and how she can connect with her meaning in the expression of that and bring that to influence change. The other example I gave you at the start was the young man who lost his leg. He was 23 years old in 1958 when that happened, when he slipped on the tracks. And he died last month. He was my dad. And he lived 62 years beyond when he wasn't expected to live. And when he busted up that concrete path with the sledgehammer sitting on his bum, he didn't think he could do anything. He didn't think he could achieve anything. And when he died last month, hundreds of people wrote us messages and letters and rang us and emailed us and talked about the way that Dad had enriched their lives, the choices he'd made about optimism, choices he made about using his big baritone voice to sing in the barbershop quartet, to barrack at our school sports, to welcome people into our home and our communities, had made such an impact. And all of that has made me think about, how do I lead? How do I influence people? How do I choose what of my meaning that I share in every interaction that I have with other people, not just in leadership, but everywhere? Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, James, for your presentation and your personal stories that you shared with us today. We have some questions, so we'll dive right into those. The first one being, how do we choose what we share about ourselves and making sure that we come across in the right way?
It's a tough one, Alexia, and I think that the best way that I can describe it is if we kind of get up above ourselves and look down on the way that we are being in our communications and go, okay, is that the way that I want to be and the impact that I want to be making? And we do this exercise with people where we say, what 3 words would you most like people to use to describe you? And then we go, okay, now what do those words sound like and what do they look like? And then we get people going, well, you know, I want to be strong. And they might say, you know, I want to come across as strong. And we go, well, what could you do differently with your body language and with your voice that makes you look and sound strong? And it might be about filling space differently. And positive. Oh, look, I really want to be positive. You know, a positive has to have a smile. So the key is to understand how you want, what your intention is, how you want to impact other people, and then what's the impact that you're having and how could you change that impact? And then it's about working at it.
All right, well, absolutely. So does practice make perfect then? Once we sort of identify what it is that we want people to see us as, do we then start, you know, practicing by looking at ourselves in the mirror, or do we record what we're saying so we make sure that we're coming across exactly as we would want?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The practice, I think, makes better. And practice continues to make us better. I don't think there's any perfect. I think we're all on a continual learning journey. But using video, even using your phone and saying, look, hello, James, you have decided that you want to be strong, positive, clear. Do silly messages like that to yourself, play them back, and then see, okay, am I coming across as those things that I'm saying that I want to be? And what am I noticing that I could change, that I could do differently? So it feels silly to use your phone or use a camera or use the mirror and practice your communications. But in fact, it's such a point of leverage for all of us. The exercise of leadership requires you to be effective in your communications. So it's worth practicing.
And communication has been so critical throughout this pandemic. So what lessons can we learn for the future, do you think, about how we communicate with others as a result of having lived through this time?
I think the big learning from this time in our communications is about the time to think, the time to prioritise, the time to slow down and improve the quality of our communications and not the quantity. And I think we've been caught up a lot in the quantity of quick communications, that highly transactional, very quick surface level communication that put us all under such demand. And now what we're doing is I think we're able to take the time, take that big breath to prioritise what's important.
Picking up on something else that you talked about in your presentation today about your dad and what he initially thought he could do, how do we overcome the self-talk in our heads and think about what we can do rather than what we can't do, and to be positive in our approach all the time, or as best we can?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not sure that I have the perfect answer for this. But I think it's about checking in with yourself over and over again and checking in with what influences you're listening to and watching. So if we listen to all the negativity in media and social media, things, and we subscribe and we allow ourselves to be influenced by those, and we subscribe to those sorts of negativities, then that's going to permeate our lives. But I always think, if you can surround yourself with people who are optimistic, the people you interact with, and you, without being too Pollyanna about it, be really clear about what you accept and what you don't accept in terms of the inputs into what you're absorbing, what you're taking in, what you're being influenced by. Because there will always be naysayers, there will always be critics, there will always be people saying that you can't do something, or that can't be achieved, or we can't save the world, whatever it is. But there will always be people who refuse to listen to that and actually make the change that is required, make things better. And it's up to all of us to do that.
Absolutely. Find those people around you that are constructive, that are positive, that fill up your bucket, that don't take away from the water out of your bucket, and help you to move forward positively as best that you can. So our final question today is, how do you choose to be optimistic when filling space? And it probably goes a little bit to your previous answer, finding those great people to have around you. But what else would you leave us with as your final comments today?
Well, the person who invited me to your festival is a bloke called Paul Chapman, who I know will be known to many people in our audience. And Paul is one of the most optimistic people I've ever met. In fact, he's rather like my dad in that way. He's so full of life. He's always looking at the way forward that is going to be positive for as many people as possible. Now, how can you choose to be optimistic? You can. Look, over the years, I've found it hard to be optimistic in periods of my life, when I've faced mental health challenges or when things have been really tough. And I think there's something that comes back to the foundations that we all have, and we all have different foundations. I'm not saying that everyone has a high quality, terrific family background or anything like that. But if you can hold on to those positive anchors and go, okay, there's something to be grateful for, there's something to be optimistic about, and then build on that a step at a time. To me, that's the way to be optimistic, and that's the way that I've got through hardships that I've had. And people like Paul Chapman and people like my dad and people like some of the people I mentioned in my speech today, people like Kamala Harris, like Malala Yousafzai, like Greta Thunberg, people who just go, actually, there's a whole lot of people saying I can't do this, or we can't change the world, we can't make things better. But there's something good here that needs to be done. And I believe in humanity enough to make some choices that are going to be tough, but will help us to progress.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for your time today, for helping us to be optimistic and to think differently. So we really appreciate you joining us today from Ballarat. Thank you very much.
It's really a pleasure, Alicia. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you to James and Shaun for joining us today, and also to our session partners, Barker's Trailers. From the team at the 2020 BIIF, we hope you are feeling inspired to tell your story with confidence. The 2020 BIIF is entirely free and runs until October 2, so hopefully you'll join us for another session soon. Take care and goodbye.